are at the bottom of our afternoon, and we are going to follow up on the next topic, which is the free trade zones, which are linked in transnational crime. We have three excellent speakers from Panama. We have Giovanni Ferrari. He is a friend of our organization, tireless fighter on all these issues. He's the manager of the Colon Free Zone here in Panama. Giovanni, if you could come up, please. We have Juan José Vides from Honduras, Customs Director from Honduras. We've started to work and cooperate with Honduras this year, so it's a pleasure to have both of you. And directly from France, virtually, we have Piotr Stryszowski. Piotr, I always apologize for the mispronunciation of your name. He's Public Governance Director of OECD, and he's with us online. Welcome, all three of you, and thank you so much for being part of our panel. I would like to give the floor first to Juan José Vides, which is the Customs Director of Honduras, so he could tell us about the situation in Honduras in regards to free trade zones. Thank you, Alejo. Good afternoon, everyone. Senator Robert, thank you very much for your invitation. Chair of the Parliament, thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to open with a question, specifically when we talk about free zones. Can somebody tell me how many free zones there are in the world? Raise your hand if you know the answer. Well, raise your hand if you know how many free zones or how many companies are in the free zones in your countries. It's a hard answer. It's very complex. Let's not think of free zones as something bad or evil. They're vehicles of investment to be able to promote exports. If we think of exports, it's the strongest element to increase the GDP in our countries. But what happens when we start to play a very perverse game and we erode the fiscal base and the fiscal incentives become perverse for tax collection? Or even further, when we see that organized crime is able to penetrate these organizations and they play against institutionality itself. I would like to tell you about the Customs Administration of Honduras. It's been created recently, and I think the CABTAG and the FMA, and for a very fast presentation. And I would like to have the idea of what happens when there are no rules and where we don't have controls, or if we don't have a very clear vision as to where we are. Illegal trade, it's an activity that entails many different crimes: contraband, counterfeiting goods, piracy, corruption, passively turning a blind eye, and many others. If we start thinking that there could even be money laundering, just like we see here in regards to trade-based money laundering, many countries work towards finding legal frameworks so that the actors that are part of these operations in the day-to-day with border police and other institutions to be able to guarantee security to our population. When we talk about custom, it's not only the security of what comes in, but also to ensure that whatever comes in upholds the safety measures, that they're paying their right tariffs, and to ensure the taxes are paid. So, what criminal activity have we found in Honduras? We've seized non-controlled chemical substances. So when we started to do joint operations, meaning that we work in a streamlined manner, there's something that we need to find here, and I thank my friend Werner Ovalle for that. Because when you have the will and they're honest people, have this desire to fight organized crime and leave a legacy for your country, you can even exchange information through WhatsApp. You know, they find something, they send information to the prosecutor, you speak to the judge, and everybody speaks to each other, and we understand that we're able to lift the barriers and we can find common ground. When we find common ground, then it becomes legitimate, and we go through each institution to be able to find and identify how to control this. It turns out that Senator Bill Cassidy mentioned yesterday, when we find a difference in an invoice or in a bill of lading, the bill of lading says that the shipper is sending an invoice for $25,000, but somebody is invoicing $100,000. That's a red flag. But if it's only a red flag control for customs just to adjust an invoice without having curiosity to further investigate, we then lose control. So in this specific case, there is 244 tons of a non-controlled chemical substance that they're chemical precursors used for drugs. We carried an operation with the prosecutor's office to see all the transits that moved from Port Cortes to the free trade zone. We looked into the inventory and we told them, you brought in X much, and we would like to know where this substance is. What happened to it? He had to justify where the goods were. How did it come into the country? We had no idea. And this is where we have this curiosity and doubt. What is happening with the companies that promote export? What is happening if we do not control chemical precursors? A different case, we saw counterfeiting documents, specifically for commodities that are paid. There was a case that I read in a previous forum. We can see that 0.02 cents, but it was a merchandise that was invoiced for $1,000. And is this something that was really going to be exported or not? And we see that in customs, we'll have to go beyond one step further to be able to identify all the banking information with the FIU to see if there's something that could also affect the economy of the country, and to see if something else that could maybe mean activity in regards to money laundering. In the agriculture sector, when we say that we give grants to export shrimp and lobster, but it's impossible to count how many shrimp they're taking out of the sea and how much they're actually shipping out, and then they report losses. No, my container was stolen. No, this other thing was stolen. And they start reporting this, and we need to think as to how to stop this. And there are many providers and sellers and vendors in the street selling something that was supposed to be exported, but it's being sold in the domestic market, that generates, a competition, an undue competition. And here we have to work with customs agents. What happens when there is a company that has an advantage, an undue advantage over another company that's paying all the taxes and all the tariffs? So if we look into history, many other companies that in all of our countries work have been working and operational for many years. We need to identify for how long they've been receiving fiscal benefits and whether the government should continue to provide benefits due to their exports. Imports without transformation. This is one of the biggest alerts in a free trade zone. So, when we talk about factories that would change anything, a good, to m- change it into something else, or should I just receive the good and stick a label on it? But what happens with the companies that are legitimately carrying out everything or paying for their taxes, that are abiding by the laws. And also, if you think about the ministries of economy, it's a right for us to support this type of benefits to those particular companies. 100% of domestic imports. So, what's going to happen with the capitalist idea of exporting? I will promote fiscal benefits where they will not pay income tax, they would not pay any tariffs or anything else, and they would not also pay for this. In other countries, we call it dumping, and sometimes they don't pay VAT. So when we have the economy of the country, specifically when we lose these controls, we think that the brilliant minds behind organized crime are thinking as to how they're able to infiltrate these other organizations to be able to talk about this because it's faster to sell 1,000 boxes of cigarettes than bring in cash. So these organizations use cash to ensure that they are able to avoid taxes. Financial behavior. Many times their financial statements do not match their documents, and when we start to talk and speak to the IRS, what are the taxes of this company that is exporting? And when I share this and I match it up with the information that I have as a customs authority, it doesn't match up. And then we need to see how to be able to follow up on this person and find a specific typology that could ensure that we are not only pertinent or relevant actors within the investigation. If we think that prosecutors think in criminal activities, but we work in a security arena, meaning that everyone should work specifically within their area of expertise. My experience, I've worked at the prosecutor's office and to understand how to typify specific activities to not lose cases in court. Well, I think that would be the topic of a different forum. So I'll ask you another question. How many of you know how many prosecution warehouses you have or holding houses you have within your countries? So I go back to my initial point. There is no way to be able to quantify this because sometimes we think that nothing is happening. In this specific case, without offending anybody, there was an internal transit of undeclared cigarettes from the Cologne free zone, from one free zone to another free zone. We need to identify how we're able to improve this, which is part of this forum. We would have a meeting with the authorities, Customs Authority here in Panama, and we spoke about this with Werner, how to improve this. And we need to be creative. Alejo, it would be really good to think of another forum where we could have a think tank to find a methodology to fight against transnational illegal crime, drug seizures, and coffee exports. Many of the countries in Central America that export coffee have had this issue. Coffee is one of those exports that are able to increase the GDP of a country, but it's something that is sought after by drug traffickers because dogs are unable to pinpoint drugs due to the smell of coffee. So many times we do the rip on and rip off where they are just able to. An exporter is concerned because they finally a container with drug got to another country and they have no idea how to do this through this rip on rip off operations. I would like everyone to reflect on this fact. How do I visualize a logistic chain? And I think about it as a train. A nice train is able to sell pretty well, not only with maritime agencies, shippers, and brokers, and it's able to, you know, do well with everyone and intermediaries. But inside, it's just a mess. looks good on the outside, but in the inside, it's just messy. We've talked about blockchain documentation, and we talked about all of these things that we are unable to coordinate because we don't have the power or the scope to be able to visualize this. So when we think about coffee and fruits, and all of this affect transnational crime. We had containers that came from Italy, Belgium, and Spain, and it was quite surprising for us the damage, the harm it would do for a country. Okay, so when we have an illicit product from a country, it really affects our vision of the country. Seizures. When we collaborate with the authorities of Spain, there was a small company that was working in Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and it was counterfeiting rum. And it was not only contraband, but counterfeiting. So this is intellectual property. It was counterfeiting or forging rum and then exporting it. We had no idea what was actually in the container. So anyone that could ingest it could have a health problem. So we were able to identify that in an export of 225,000 of counterfeit drug in Spain, a criminal network that worked in Honduras but would trade and send this to Spain all through the free zones. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say that everyone here, in regards to security, we are here and we've been able to identify there are many issues that could affect money laundering, and that's what banks are there for. And they've been able to bring in everything necessary to ensure that it doesn't happen. But you know what? That's only the front door. But through the back door, international trade, we are losing. Everything's coming through the back door.
Qué mensaje fuerte ese de la...
Such a strong message in regards to the front door and the back door of international trade. I would like to welcome, and I believe that he's online, Mr. Piotr from the OECD. You are online.
To join us. Hello, Piotr.
Hello, good evening, good afternoon.
Please, the floor is yours. Do you have any presentation?
Thank you. Yes, I do have a presentation. I'd be very grateful if it could be uploaded. And let me say it's a real pleasure and honor to be here at this great forum. Let me also say that I very much regret I cannot be with you in person. Unfortunately, the sanitary situation in France is not good enough yet, and we are still banned from making any official international travel. But yet, thanks to the technological advancements, I'm able to be there with you. And well, I want to also thank the previous speaker for excellent presentation, full of really relevant examples. My presentation will be slightly different. We'll take a step back and focus on, well, on the one hand, on evidence on the issues of abuse of free trade zones in illicit trade, but on the other hand, on the solutions that we can provide to counter this threat. The previous speaker also mentioned the notion of coffee being abused to conceal some contraband. And actually, I must say, I'm really grateful to have some coffee with me because it's past 11 p.m. in France. So thanks to this formidable beverage, I'm able here to deliver the speech. My name is Piotr Stryszowski, and at the OECD, I manage the Task Force on Countering Illicit Trade. The OECD is an international organization that is basically providing evidence, facts on current economic problems that, well, sheds some light on these problems and also suggests what the solution could be. The task force that I manage, of course, as its name suggests, looks at the problems of illicit trade. So next slide, please. So let me begin very briefly with the modus operandi of the task force. It's very basic. As you can see, there are 3 steps that we follow. The first step is evidence, right? Facts. any policy making, we believe, should be based on facts. Unfortunately, illicit trade by definition is illicit. So here, data are hard to find, and I would say 80% of our work is looking at evidence, looking for evidence, right? We, being an international organization, have this luxury of having access to excellent customs data or enforcement data that provide us with some skeleton of information how illicit trade operates, where these goods are shipped from, where these goods are shipped to, what modes of transport are abused, what are the sizes, trends, etc., etc. But statistical data are not everything. So lots of our work are interviews with experts from enforcement community, from trade community, from industry, from all sorts of communities that might complement these data with crucial expert knowledge. And once we provide this evidence, once we develop knowledge of how illicit trade looks like these days, then gradually we come at, I would say, scoping of governance gaps, of trying to understand why some parts become more abused than the other, why in some areas the climate for criminals that run illicit trade is so good. So we go here then from evidence into guidance. We say to policymakers, hey, why don't you focus on such issues as free trade zones? Because in these areas there might be some problems, there might be some gaps to be filled. But once we do it, the next step, the very last step, is the implementation. Because it's not enough to say there might be some issues with free trade zone. It is necessary to say how exactly to fix it. And this modus operandi we basically try to implement in all areas of illicit trade, in all aspects, not only for free trade zones, but also such issues as information sharing, small parcels, or problems with online platforms. But today, let me provide you some evidence and, sketch some solutions related to free trade zones. Next slide, please. Let's begin with evidence. What we know about illicit trade and free trade zones. Here, let me take, I would say, a couple of steps back and, get to the reports that we've published several years ago. As I said, providing evidence on illicit trade is not easy. It's not like you take the data, put the data into a econometric apparatus, and then you have a set of tables that tell you the whole truth. No, the process is very slow, it's very laborious. It goes step by step by step. And at one point, when we try to gauge the map of routes in illicit goods, we concluded that free trade zones appear on this map too frequently. There is some anomalies related to free trade zones. We were scratching this surface that on average, and here I want to highlight, on average, free trade zones spur illicit trade. Put it differently, the evidence that we have demonstrates that on average, illicit trade is driven by free trade zones. These quantitative findings that you can see on the screen, there is this cover with some fancy picture, was then complemented with dialogues with experts. We had a number of dialogues. One of them was carried out in a beautiful city of Alicante in Spain, in the headquarters of European IP Office. And basically these experts from trade community, from industry community, and from enforcement community said, of course, there is some problems with free trade zones. The suggestions provided by data are true. So our narrative can be changed from there seems to be a problem with free trade zones, a problem with some free trade zones, right? These experts and these dialogues provided us with some additional facts and also pointed at some findings from our analysis. And these findings were that, in fact, the abuse of some free trade zones is more systemic than we think. In particular, there are clear signals that near certainty that free trade zones in illicit trade are abused only or mostly by organized crime with strong links to terrorist networks. Of course, this is not our core area of work. Here I need to defer to expertise of our colleagues from Europol and Interpol. But anyway, let me just highlight two very interesting facts. The first one is the fact that when you look again at the map of routes in illicit trade, you do not only find free trade zones there, but you also find countries with very weak or almost no governance. Countries like Syria or Afghanistan appear there very frequently. And that suggests that indeed terrorist networks or, well, organized criminal networks that operate in these countries might or, well, actually do have stake in illicit trade that then at one point also passes through free trade zones. So this is the first hint. The second hint is the of illicit trade. Only illicit trade in countries amounts to like 450 billion US dollars a year. 450 billion US dollars a year. This is the order of magnitude of GDP of Belgium. This is not order of magnitude of a jackpot in the lottery. No, this is humongous scale. This is scale that can be generated only by well-organized criminal networks that have access to whole logistical chain, that can control every aspect of this chain, starting from production and liquid distribution. So these two signals, presence of countries with failed governance or poor governance, and the humongous scale of this process clearly point at strong involvement of organized crime in illicit trade that also abuses some free trade zones. These dialogues that we carried out not only provided some facts about the scale, magnitude, and nature of this problem. Of course, that was fascinating to learn what sort of goods are passing through free trade zones, right? Looking at the business models, how cigarettes are smuggled, how actually counterfeiting takes place in some free trade zones. That was fascinating. And I feel real urge in going into these great anecdotes because that's very interesting. But let me instead of that, let me just focus on reasons, on the diagnosis, why this happens, and on proposed solutions. When we did these dialogues, talking to experts, and when we did additional research, one thing became really apparent: why some free trade zones become so attractive for criminals. And actually, it's not a surprise, it's a trivial fact, but the reasons that are behind establishing free trade zones, which is lower oversight, less bureaucracy, easier checks. In many cases, when these factors are paralleled with, I would say, or lack of IPR respect or corruption, these factors, lower oversight, less bureaucracy, less controls, these factors become actually very much favorable for criminals that run illicit trade networks, right? On top of that, in some free trade zones, there is a fundamental misunderstanding that a zone is actually outside country's jurisdiction when it comes especially to customs control. When talking to, well, several customs officers from, well, some countries that appear on this list of abused free trade zones, I've heard sentences like, hey, it's a free trade zone. We have nothing to do with that. It's outside our jurisdiction. Well, it's not. Free trade zones remain in a country that hosts these zones. This is something everybody agrees with, right? So this misunderstanding also is beneficial for criminals that find in these free trade zones great conditions for their activities. And the last reason why many free trade zones become so frequently abused is, well, great logistical facilities. In many zones, actually zones are created to facilitate trade, right? Free trade zones. So many zones have great, I would say, logistical transport facilities made for transit, storage, or even manipulation with goods. That, when abused by criminals, can be, well, perfect conditions for illicit trade to flourish. And when we pair this with low oversight by customs, or even no oversight by customs, that's the ideal recipe for illicit trade to grow. So what is the missing component here? Well, one term, transparency. Next slide, please. Now I'll just spend, well, a couple of minutes to flag a potential solution to these problems. Because it's not that all free trade zones are abused by criminals. It's not like in every single free trade zones, criminals take advantage. Unfortunately, there are some apples that are rotten. And these rotten apples, well, they, I would say, ruin the reputation of all the apples. And when I talk to my colleagues from DG Taxud of the European Commission, they have, I would say, slightly reduced or I would say moderate reputation about free trade zones. So to fix this problem, to empower those zones that are, I would say, clean, that want really to spur trade, the OECD has adopted a recommendation on enhancing transparency in free trade zones. This recommendation, of course, is a non-binding legal instrument that is issued to all adhering jurisdictions. This is not a recommendation that is only for OECD member countries. This is a recommendation for everyone. And this recommendation includes a code of conduct, which is a very simple one-pager with some keywords, with some, I would say, even hashtags for free trade zones on what steps to take in order not to be abused by criminals in illicit trade. These are very simple hashtags, very simple solutions, like incentivize cashless payments, or proactively cooperate with enforcement in your country, looking for anomalies in trade, or maintain detailed records of goods coming into a zone, staying in zone, and leaving zone, and provide all these records immediately upon request from enforcement authorities. This is not rocket science here. This is just basic principles of transparency that are in this recommendation. And the purpose of this recommendation is actually to empower those zones that want to be clean, that want to be transparent, and give them a tool to, on the other hand, implement it to be transparent, but also signal their readiness, their high standards that they have with respect to transparency, with respect to economic activity. And really to go one step further, to give them this opportunity, to give this signal. Next slide, please. We are working these days on a certification scheme. This certification scheme has been mandated by OECD member countries. So we, as the task force, got the mandate from our member countries to do this assessment mechanism, right? Assessment mechanism that will tell whoever, customs, financial institutions, credit rating institutions, whether a given free trade zone is clean or not, whether a given free trade zones maintain high transparency standards or not. Again, this certification scheme will be voluntary and will build on this code of conduct in the recommendation. So basically for every set of criteria, we are developing, I would say, quantitative measures that will tell whether a zone complies or not with these criteria. The certification scheme is currently being developed in collaboration with testing inspection and certification industry. And we really hope to provide our member countries and everyone who's interested in increasing transparency in free trade zones with some result this fall 2021. So please stay with us. Please continue, of course, your great job. Keep in mind that it takes free trade zones to fix their problems, of course, together with support and collaboration of governments. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Otherwise, thank you so much for having me. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Piotr.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pure. I know that this time is very late in Paris. We do appreciate and thank you so much for this. I'll leave you online just in case we have any questions at the end of the panel. So if we continue talking about free trade zones and some of the recommendations of the OECD, I think it was very important to have Mr. Giovanni Ferrari with us, which is the general manager of the second biggest free trade zone in the world. A free trade zone that it's always in part of every forum, and it's important for them to be here and to say what the free trade zone is doing to stop everything that has been mentioned. Giovanni, the floor is yours.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have been working for the past 40 years in a free trade zone, and every time I must talk about the free trade zone, there's always previous or prior comments where people doubt the viability of a free trade zone, or why do countries need free trade zones. I think that some of the comments that we previously heard, not only from the previous speaker, sometimes those comments would make us question why we should have certain free trade zones. I think it's a very valid comment, but first I think we should think of who defines creating a free trade zone in any part of the world. And the government. It's actually the government who provides the charter or the mandate to be able to establish in a part of the world a specific activity. So, who first should weigh upon the level of the viability of establishing a free trade zone in any part of their domestic territory, and if it holds the right business model to ensure that there is an honest, correct, traceable activity, to ensure that it makes sense and that it can provide or promote resources to the state. It's the government. I think that in 1948, when the government started this, they did not do this on their own. They did it with the advice and the support of the United States of America and its government, which, with a very good formula, was able to provide the base to start the Cologne Free Trade Zone. I'm sorry, I'll remove my face mask to ensure that you're able to understand me better. I'll start by providing general information in regards to statistics of the free trade zone. Like I said, it was founded on June 17th of 1948 under the President Enrique Jimenez after the advice of the government of the United States after the local economic crisis after the end of the World War II. So, what were just a few square blocks of land has continued to grow, and now it's over 1,000 hectares of land. like it was mentioned by your friend Alejo, which makes us the biggest free trade zone in the continent and considered the second largest worldwide. Within the free trade zone, we have over 2,600 companies and organizations with logistics and trade activities. And I think is where I would like to talk about my specific comment in regards to the business model or the logic in regards to the Cologne Free Trade Zone bases itself on its geographical position, being close to the Panama Canal, through which 6% of global trade which transit through the canal, and where we have a transport logistic cluster for multimodal transport, whether it's maritime, air, or even land through Central America, meaning that we have all the features in regards to effective cost of transport and the frequency of transport that is necessary was able to achieve the greatest benefit, which is to ensure that the product is received in the right amount at the time that is needed and at the right price. And I think that this is the winning formula for any free trade zone. The very distinguished director of Customs of Honduras. He asked this question. I did not raise my hand. I have an outdated number, but I did have an answer. But I understand that in the continent of America, there's over 500 free trade zones. And worldwide, there were over 3,500 at some point. Now I have as a homework to see if those numbers are up to date or not. But it allows us to understand the dimensions of a phenomenon which is quite extensive, not only here in our specific region, but rather worldwide. I'd like to continue with more statistics in regards to the Cologne Free Trade Zone. Today, this activity is able to generate, and even though the pandemic has taken its toll, over 1,500 direct jobs, along with another 25,000 jobs, which are auxiliary positions or indirect jobs, would make 40,000 jobs, which are able to support 100,000 persons, because there's families with several dependents, meaning that we are a very important component of the economy in the city of Cologne. To be able to compare these numbers, the Panama Canal, as I mentioned, is able to move 6% of global trade through it, has 9,000 direct jobs. Re-exporting from the Cologne Free Trade Zone into all the countries in the region during the year of 2020, which was a pretty bad year due to the pandemic, reached a number of $7.9 billion, taking into account that half of the companies had closed down for at least 6 months due to the health emergency and due to the lack of activity within the entire region. These these numbers, the 7.9 billion, is made up by many different goods, not only commodities, but also luxury items. Now, after my prologue, I would like to go into the issues of security and risk, which are the main topics for this forum. And I'll be glad to share these points with you. It is not a secret that the Cologne Free Trade Zone has been pointed at as a source of illegal trade, like money laundering and contraband. And I have a different statistics that I'd like to share. We've seen a case of cigarettes. And when we talk about the heading of cigarettes, it's 0.7% of all our re-exportations. So it's not one of the main headings that we work with. As a state agency and the management of the Cologne Free Trade Zone, and I'd like to say that the Cologne Free Trade Zone, it's one of the few zones where the land and its administration are actually public, meaning that its administration has public servants, which is quite different to other countries where free trade zones are private entities that have a charter behalf of the government to be able to exercise those activities with benefits. However, us as a free trade zone are one of the few that worldwide are 100% public. However, we are aware of the need to be able to coordinate activities where we are able to supervise at a national and international level. I would like to mention some of the activities that, in accordance to the different risk areas that we have found, and I would like to summarize this into 7 different headings. The first, verifying companies that seek a space or position within the free trade zone. To be established within the free trade zone, you need to send in an application through forms that we can use for background checks with international databases of all the members of the boards, but also of the managers. This is a function that is not carried out by the Cologne Free Trade Zone, but actually the law enforcement agencies of our country carries out this specific task, and it's very important. And I think no free trade zone in any part of the world should not have this independent screening to ensure that criminal organizations are unable to work within it. Employees, providers, and vehicles that requires access into our area needs to go through an application process where we're able to provide passes and regulate their transit inside the free trade zone. Second heading, the flow of sensitive products. Within the free trade, we've identified as sensitive cigarettes, liquor, medications, and food. They are all used, ingested, or consumed by humans. So all the companies that decide to trade in these products should apply or need to apply for a special permit for traceability. We've started the new modality of registering all the companies that provide storage and transportation, even though they do not participate in the trade process. We need to have a level of visibility of anybody that's able to add value to the distribution of those specific products. My third heading, originality of the product. We have our own office for intellectual property. We interdict any forgery and other parallel markets that do not comply with the policies of the owners of the brands, which could be unauthorized trading of merchandise all the way to having the right storage facilities. Number 4, traceability of mobility and transport. Even though we have a robust digital platform, we need to improve identifying the flow of specific mobility. There is data confidentiality that still needs to be solved, but it's a trend that should continue to ensure that we're able to monitor and further risk analysis. We are committed to continue to modify our data management system to ensure that we can include very important points. Number 5, transaction payments. Even though there is the movement of merchandise that do not generate banking transactions within the national banking system, and it's because global companies that manage their sales and handle all of this outside of Panama and outside of the Panama Free Trade Zone. Or maybe the payments are through wires that are received in Panama and they have all their documents that are supported. The free trade zone is quite aware of all the problems of cross border flows of cash for the specific purchasing and sales within our area. As a matter of fact, I must say that we are pleased to see the presentation that was shared yesterday in regards to digital currency, which would certainly solve all of these issues, where we would facilitate operators where they do not have to travel with cash and do not have to pay high costs for international wires and transfers. While we wait for all of this to become a reality, in regards to local legislation, there's already a draft law at the National Assembly that's able to regulate the procedure of cash flows into the country. Number 6, risk management. The Free Trade Zone and the Custom Authority have a risk analysis management where they're able to focus on specific tasks of intelligence, gathering data, and intervention. This is still in the early stages, but it will be an additional tool for the joint management of the risk amongst both institutions. But just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the work for suspicious activity, in 2020, which was a bad year for the Colombian Free Trade Zone, there was 487,587 transshipment transports and re-exports, almost 500,000 transactions of international trade operations. Seventh point, coordination with government agencies. At the Free Trade Zone, we have identified the potential and close collaboration with the following agencies: Customs Authority, Ministry of Security, the Bank Superintendency, the Superintendency of the DNFBP, FIU, National Police, and Public Ministry. Without this coordination, we would dilute the work of the different agencies that start processes that could take too long, or because they're unable to gather enough information, cannot move forward. Consolidating all 7 areas that I've mentioned together place the Colombian Free Trade Zone in a position of leadership with high standards. But it's very important to highlight that this level of control cannot be the prerogative of our free trade zone only, or even of those that do not want to allow for illicit trade to operate in a territory. If there are any other free trade zone with lax or inexistent controls, there will be fertile ground so that criminal organizations can relocate where they're not bothered. If I can follow up on the words of Mr. Piotr, this is a call to ensure that the standard of a regulatory framework for risk management should be a strict compliance of the free trade zones in the regions, but also worldwide. And here I would like to wrap up my presentation. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll be here for any other questions. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Giovanni. Siempre es bueno tener de primera fuente.
Thank you so much for that first-hand information about what is happening in the Cologne Free Zone. Thank you to all three of you, and I don't know if we have any questions from the audience, either for Mr. Piotr, from José from Honduras, from the Customs Organization, or for our dear friend Giovanni, the General Manager of the Cologne Free Zone. If not, then we will move on to our next panel. Thank you so much for participating in this forum today.